My name is Justin Adams. I work in the recruitment team at NSWT's head office near Birmingham. And hopefully you'll have been to some of our other webinars that we've run over the summer. But this is our final week of summer sessions, but we will be inviting you to more hopefully later in the year. You have been invited and you're here because you're already an NASUWT member as an NQT. So thank you for joining us. You're eligible for support from the union if you need it, so please do contact us. But today you've joined us to listen to my colleague Darren Northcott, who's the National Official for Education at NASUWT, to talk about your induction rights. So I will now hand you over to him, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Justin, and good morning, everyone. As Justin says, my name's Darren Northcott. I'm the National Official for Education at the NASUWT, and today we're going to talk about some of your rights and entitlements as newly qualified teachers in a very particular context, and that's obviously around COVID-19 and the impact that that's had and will continue to have on schools. I was thinking just before we started that I was in the position that you are in, which is about to start your professional careers as qualified teachers, about 26 years ago. And that's a very sobering thought if you're me. And as you might expect, a lot of things have changed in that time. A classroom in 1994, in many respects, looks very different from a classroom in 2020. But some things do remain the same. Some things are constant, some things are timeless about teaching. And one of those features of teaching that never seems to change is that teaching is a very demanding occupation. It's a very challenging way to earn a living, and it always has been and probably always will be, but it's also an extremely important job. It's a job that allows you to make profound changes to the lives of individuals and to make a unique and distinctive contribution to the society in which we all live. So we would say, and we're biased, but we would say teaching is the most important job in the world, and you're all about to embark upon your careers as qualified teachers in, as I say, a very, very distinctive and unique context. So we'll talk about that. So what I'm going to do is just share some slides with you. We will make these slides available to you so that you don't have to scrabble around trying to jot down everything that I say. So hopefully that will be something that will be of benefit to you. We'll make these available to you, but I'll just talk through some of the key points that we think are going to be important to you as you begin your induction. I'll talk for a little while. There's quite a few points that I want to make, but at the end, if there's time, I'll try and answer some of the questions that you're able to raise in the chat function, and I'll try and address as many of those as I can. What I would say though, right at the beginning, is if you've got a concern about your own personal circumstances, so the school you might be working in, the way in which your induction's being arranged, if you have any concerns in that respect, it's probably best for you to get in touch with us personally, and we can talk you through that. And I'll put some information in the presentation at the end about how you can do that. But any general questions you've got about induction, I'll be more than happy to try and answer those. And if we can't answer them, we'll absolutely take them away and make sure that those questions and those issues that you've raised are addressed in the advice and guidance that we produce. So let's have a look at the main kind of things that I want to talk about today. So the first thing I want to talk about is obviously the implications of COVID-19 on all teachers, which obviously includes you, and also on newly qualified teachers in particular. So that's a really important issue to get a grip of right at the beginning. I then want to talk about the statutory rights and entitlements that all newly qualified teachers have. And then I want to talk about something called the Early Career Framework, the ECF, which may impact upon some of you depending on where you're going to start your induction. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll give you the most up-to-date information that we have about the Early Career Framework so that you've got that But what I will say right at the beginning is that this is still a rapidly changing situation, and more information is coming to light almost on a daily basis. But I'll give you the most up-to-date picture and some advice and guidance about how, if you're part of the early career, you can engage with that and what it might mean for you. Okay, let's think about some of the ongoing implications of COVID-19. And you will all know that the pandemic has had a really significant impact on the education system. So we had what was known as the partial closure of schools in late March. And then during the course of the spring term and the summer term, schools were open to children of key workers and to children who were identified as vulnerable. In England, during the course of the summer term, schools opened their doors to a slightly wider group of pupils, but by any measure, schools haven't been operating as they normally would be since March. And the current plan in England is for all pupils to return to school from September. So that's where we are currently. So moving away from this restricted access to schools with an awful lot of remote and blended learning that schools have had to provide at very short notice, moving to having almost all students and pupils on site from the start of the autumn term. So the disruption that resulted from the partial closure of schools was significant, but it's still going to be the case, and I think everyone accepts this, that schools will not be operating in a typical way from September. And I think that disruption has impacted upon everyone in the education system, certainly on children and young people. And we know that from what we see in schools and some of the evidence that's emerged, and that's very clear. Certainly significant disruption for staff working in schools and for others who depend upon schools, so families, wider community. The disruption has been significant. And I think that's a really important point. To understand that we've got an education system that's been under a lot of pressure. That's an important consideration, certainly as far as we're concerned. So we have a plan for pupils to return to school from September, but those plans might need to change very quickly. So we've seen in the news, for example, issues around local lockdowns. So you've got a national picture COVID-19, that because the prevalence of the virus in some parts of the country has been higher, you get greater restrictions, local lockdowns in those areas. Going forward from September, those local lockdowns may impact upon schools, and they may impact upon schools with very short notice. So a school may go from a place in time when pretty much all of its students are attending on site to, within a matter of days, a situation where it's only catering for children of key workers and vulnerable children, and the majority of children will be accessing education through remote and blended learning. So schools are going to have to switch sometimes very quickly from a more traditional model of education to something that relies very heavily on blended and remote learning. That is something that currently the government is developing some advice and guidance around local lockdowns, but what is clear is that they could happen at very short notice and they'll have a big impact on schools in those areas. You may also get outbreaks in individual schools. You may have an area where the prevalence of the virus is particularly high. There's been an outbreak in a school, and that outbreak may mean that some or even all of the students and the staff at that school can't attend school, and that again might happen at very short notice. And then we all hope not, of course, but if there is an increase in, if you like, the national incidence of COVID-19, then national arrangements around the opening of schools may have to change. So one thing we've learned, certainly as an education system since March, is that things change incredibly quickly, and it's very difficult to predict from one week to the next what is going to happen. So the situation is very turbulent, it's very fluid. From our point of view, we want to make sure that all pupils are back in school. We've been very clear that school is the best place for children and young people, but our absolute overriding concern is that that has to be done in a way that is safe for everyone, certainly safe for the staff that work in schools, and safe for the children and young people who attend those schools. So we've produced a lot of advice and guidance for members on all aspects of COVID-19 and the impact it has on the education system, including the September opening of schools. If you look on our website, you'll be able to find that advice and guidance. And I think if I were to advise you to do anything, is keep an eye on that advice and guidance, because obviously as situations change, and they change quickly, we have to change our advice as quickly as we can also. We do, in terms of alerting you and other members to changes to advice and guidance, we have a fortnightly and sometimes at the moment weekly member update, which we send out to all members for whom we have an email address. So that could be a really good way of just alerting you to changes in our advice and guidance. So please do keep an eye on that. So on big impact of COVID-19 on everyone in the education system, but there are some particular issues around newly qualified teachers and induction. And one of the things that we saw last year, so with the previous cohort, the 2019-20 cohort, was that obviously the induction regulations, the guidance make clear that what NQTs need to do is spend a particular amount of time working with children and young people in classrooms in order to be assessed for induction at the end of that induction period. And as we know, one of the impacts of COVID-19 was that it restricted many NQTs from going into school and from teaching in the way they typically would. And we were very clear that those disruptions to induction shouldn't impact adversely on newly qualified teachers. So we were pleased that the government introduced flexibilities that effectively meant that if an individual NQT's induction had been shortened or disrupted because of the impact of COVID-19, because there were no students in schools to teach, merely by virtue of that fact, an NQT should not be denied the ability to pass induction. So the regulations were changed last year to allow that to happen. So a lot of NQTs, or pretty much all NQTs in last year's cohort, who weren't able to complete their induction were still deemed to have passed their induction because of these flexibilities. And that was a necessary change in order to make sure that individuals who are following programs of induction weren't disadvantaged by the impact of COVID-19. The DfE has now said that those flexibilities will continue into 2020-21. So therefore, if you're an NQT and for whatever reason, the ability of your school to operate normally, to operate fully, is impacted by a local lockdown, by an outbreak, by changes in the national picture, that will not impact upon you adversely. So no NQT is going to be denied induction merely by virtue of the fact that COVID-19 has had an impact on their school. So check the DfE website and our website as well for further updates on the position around induction, but that is the current position. We produce something called an induction handbook that sets out a lot of this information in greater detail than I can do here, but do look at our website because that will be a good source of information for you about some of the changes that may happen to induction as a result of COVID-19. Bearing in mind, unfortunately, as I say, one of the features of COVID-19 has been it's led to a real challenge in predicting what is going to happen next, because in effect, the virus is in control and it's the prevalence of the virus then impacts upon what the education system does. So do keep an eye out for updates in that respect. So we recognise that you're undertaking your induction in very difficult and different circumstances, but there are some rights and entitlements that NQTs have that you will continue to have, notwithstanding COVID-19 and its impact on schools. I'm going to talk about those rights. I want to be really clear at the beginning that the rights I'm going to talk about, the entitlements that you have, apply to all NQTs. So if you're someone who's taking part in the early career framework, the point to take away from this next section is that all these rights still apply to you, even though you're taking part in the early career framework. If you're not taking part in the early career framework, here is a summary of your key rights and entitlements. And I'll say at the beginning, The rights and entitlements you have are quite extensive. Documents, which I'll touch on in a moment, that give you those rights and entitlements are fairly complex. And what I'm going to do here is just summarize in a moment the key ones, but there's more to it than I've got the time to explore this morning. But look out for, again, the induction handbook that we produce, which sets out that advice and guidance in more detail. But the reason it's important you're aware of your rights and entitlements is because, like all teachers, this is particularly the case for NQTs, this is one of those unchanging features system, is that you will often be reminded of your responsibilities as a teacher on a fairly frequent basis. And because teaching is a very important role in our society, then it's probably right that you are aware of your responsibilities and the significant responsibility you have as teachers. But in order to meet those responsibilities, you also have rights and entitlements. So you can't discharge your responsibilities unless your rights and entitlements are respected. Two go together hand in glove, as it were. Just a brief detour in where your rights and entitlements come from. They're mainly set out in the 2012 induction regulations, which are supported by statutory guidance. So the rights and entitlements we're talking about here are legal rights and entitlements. They're set out in law, and everyone involved in induction is legally obliged to abide by the provisions of the regulations and the guidance that's set out in the published statutory guidance. And that applies in every setting where an NQT is employed. It doesn't matter what type of setting you're working in, whether it's a maintained school, whether it's an academy, preschool, a sixth form college, an FE college, an independent school. Every employer that employs newly qualified teachers must make sure that it is adhering to those regulations and that guidance. And our view is really clear that if an employer cannot or will not perhaps meet its obligations under the regulations, under the guidance, it's got no business employing NQTs. Employers should only employ NQTs if they are clear that they can conform with the requirements in the regulations and in the guidance. So that's very important. The other point I'll just make here, the other footnote, is around the teacher standard, because this point comes up quite a lot. And the teacher standards, 2012 teacher standards, are the standards that are used at the end of your induction to determine whether you've completed induction successfully. And you'll be familiar with the structure and content of those teacher standards, because they are the same standards that are used to judge whether you should be awarded QTS or not. And it's an odd situation that the standards for awarding QTS, the standards for determining whether you've passed induction, are exactly the same standards. And that's quite an anomalous situation. Time was, many years ago, there were different standards. There was a different set of standards you had to meet to be awarded QTS. And then there were different standards for induction. And to some extent that made sense, because going from QTS to being in a place where you've completed induction is a progression. You develop your skills, your knowledge, your understanding, and it probably made sense that there were a different set of standards. Since 2012, that hasn't been the case. So how can it be that the standards for induction are the same as the standards for QTS? And I think the best way of looking at it, the most sensible way of looking at it, is that what you're trying to do during your induction is show that you can take the skills, the knowledge, the expertise associated with the standards when you were awarded QTS, and show that you can apply that skill, knowledge, and understanding in a different context. The context being employed as a teacher in a setting with all the responsibilities that come with that. So it's about the context within which the standards are used, even though the standards are the same. There's some specific advice and guidance that I'd recommend you have a look at on our website, which is around how you might demonstrate that you're meeting the standards. So one of the things you have to do, and this is different from after you've passed induction, but one of the things you have to do in induction is demonstrate that you've met all of the standards so that you can be deemed to have completed induction successfully. That can be done very well. It can be done badly, and schools and employers can organise that badly. So we've got some advice and guidance on our website that shows how you might start thinking about, it's probably worth thinking about this from the outset, how you might think about demonstrating that you're meeting the standards, what sort of things should you be thinking about, what sort of things should you be doing, so that when you're in a position where, in effect, you're being asked, have you met the teacher standards, and that's the test, you can be confident that you have, and that you've organised your evidence in a way that will make sense and demonstrate very clearly that you should complete your induction. Okay, I'm going to run through 10 rights now. So what we've done is distilled from the regulations, from the guidance, 10 headline rights, if you like, but it's probably worth you noting particularly carefully at this stage, just prior to you commencing induction. And the first of those rights that you have, don't forget, apply to everyone, legal rights, is a reduction in timetable teaching time. So because you're an NQT, you get an entitlement to a reduction in timetable teaching time, and that is 10% of the timetable teaching time. So 10% of timetable teaching time should be organised in a way that takes you out of the classroom so you can focus on the work you need to do in order to demonstrate that you're meeting the induction standards. In many settings, not all, but in many settings, in addition to that reduction in timetable teaching time, you also have an entitlement to what's known as planning, preparation, and assessment time, PPA time. So if you work in a school that is maintained by a local authority, then because of what's known as the school teachers pay and conditions document, I'll go into too much detail around that, but it's important you're aware of that. That's your contractual statutory contract as a teacher. That will give you a contractual and statutory entitlement to PPA time on top of your induction time. And that is also 10% of timetable teaching time, but, and it's often the way of these things, they're calculated slightly differently, but a very rough rule of thumb is that both equate to 10%. So if you take, for example, a typical scenario, perhaps where someone is working full-time, 5 days a week in a school undertaking induction, where PPA time is a contractual entitlement, then they should be entitled to the equivalent of 1 day of those 5 days out of the classroom, either doing PPA or activities related to induction. Just to note, PPA time applies in almost all academies and free schools as well. Requirements around it, because academies and free schools set their own terms and conditions beyond those set out in the school teachers pay and conditions document. They can vary from employer to employer, but in broad terms, it's safe to say most academies and free schools, most multi-academy trusts will have some form of PPA time in the contract. But if you work in an academy and a free school, it's worth checking. Sixth form colleges have some time that you might describe as equivalent to that, but again, they are independent employers, so there's a kind of common set of terms and conditions, but again, individual employers can vary it, so you need to check. Most independent schools, most FE colleges don't have PPA time. Some do, but it's important to check your individual circumstances. But in any event, wherever you are working, you have that entitlement to 10% reduction in timetable teaching time because you are newly qualified teachers. The second right you have is, if you like, not teaching outside the age range or subject for which you have been trained. So this works in slightly different ways depending upon whether you're working in secondary or post-secondary, or whether you're working in primary. So for secondary teachers, the best way of looking at this is that most secondary teachers, I think, would tell you that actually it's quite good to have a second subject, if you like, something else that you can offer a potential employer, because that perhaps enhances your employability. So if you're a maths teacher, let's say, but you're able to teach PE competently, you can offer that as a second subject. That's all to the good. That's going to make you more attractive to potential employers. So no problem with that. But you've got to be careful during your induction year, because if you're spending a significant amount of time focusing on your second subject, so a subject for which you may not have been trained, to the detriment of teaching the subject that you were trained to teach, then that's not really giving you the best possible opportunity of demonstrating that you've met the teacher standards in the context of induction. There'll be plenty of time for you to explore your second subject when you've completed induction, and a little bit of experience is probably not a bad thing. It's probably acceptable, if you like, during your NQT year, but problems arise when you're having to spend an awful lot of your time teaching a subject that isn't your main subject. And all employers of NQTs know that they shouldn't really do that. They should really allow you to concentrate on your main subject and shouldn't detract you second subject or subject to teach. For primary teachers, the basic expectation, and this is really important for all primary teachers to understand right at the outset of their career, is that even if you were trained to focus on a particular segment, if you like, of primary years. So to give you an example, in my case, I was a primary teacher, and my PGCE focused on children aged 3 to 7. And that's still quite common. It doesn't always happen. You do get courses that are focused on 3 to 11. But even if you were trained to teach a segment of primary years, and even if you have a preference for teaching younger children or older children, the basic expectation is that as a primary teacher, you can be expected to teach all of the primary years. That goes from essentially reception to year 6. That is an expectation that is in the system. Some teachers have spent a lot of time focusing on teaching reception year 1, year 2, or maybe year 5 and year 6. And sometimes they're asked to go and teach a very different age range, cross a key stage and teach, if you've been teaching year 5 and 6 for a long time, going to teach year 1 or reception. And we would say in those circumstances, that might be a reasonable expectation, but you should still support and give advice, guidance, information, additional training and development necessary for a teacher who you want to go and teach in a year group that they haven't taught for a long time, or they may never have taught at all. But it's important to understand that basic expectation. And I'll just give you an example from my own experience. When I was having an interview for the first job I got as a teacher, I had an interview with the head teacher, and he asked me what year group would I prefer to teach. This was a year reception to year 6 primary school. And I said, well, my training was mainly focused on the early years and key stage 1, so I'd prefer that. And he said to me, well, okay, I'll note that, thank you. And I got a letter over the summer holiday that confirmed I would be teaching year 4, which wasn't quite what I expected, but I did teach that year 4, and it was a really good experience. So bear that in mind, primary colleagues. There is a really clear expectation across the primary age ranges that you would be able to teach across all of those. But if you need support to do that, you're also entitled to that support. The third right I'll just touch on briefly, oops, just skip ahead there, is to access and experience the planning procedures used by the teacher. So in blunt terms, what this means is that you shouldn't be doing additional lesson planning merely by virtue of the fact that you are newly qualified teachers. The whole point of induction is that you get used to the systems and structures that other teachers use. You are qualified teachers, you're working as qualified teachers, therefore you need to use planning procedures. It may even be assessment procedures, but all the procedures in the school generally that the other teachers use, you should use as well. You certainly shouldn't be expected to do the kind of lesson planning that you might have been expected to do during your initial teacher training. And we all know what that's like. There's extremely lengthy expositions about the lesson you're going to teach that probably take longer to write than the lesson itself took, and then the very long evaluation of the lesson you taught afterwards. That may have its place when you're acquiring QTS, but you've now got QTS. So you've demonstrated that you understand what a lesson plan looks like and how to evaluate a lesson. Didn't understand that, you wouldn't have QTS. Point now is to apply that skill in an employed context. And frankly, planning is extremely onerous and burdensome, then the work of teachers is not sustainable. Interesting to note, there's been a lot of work recently about planning and a lot of thinking about planning in schools. And I think there's a growing realization that excessive burdensome planning probably isn't helping teachers focus on teaching and learning, providing high quality educational experiences for the children and young people that they teach. So again, look at our website, there's quite a lot of interesting things on there around planning and some of the work that's been done recently, and practice across the system generally is getting better, but there are certainly schools out there that insist upon needless, burdensome, excessive planning requirements. But that's a problem for the whole school to address. As far as you're concerned as newly qualified teachers, your minimum expectation is you shouldn't be doing extra planning just because you're entitled to support from a mentor. The mentor will be a really important person in your induction experience. I think some of the things to bear in mind around the mentor is that perhaps the most important characteristic a good mentor has is availability. So you may have someone who's an excellent coach who can provide you with challenge and support, is someone that really is a source of information and expertise upon which you can draw. But if they're never available, then that's probably not going to be very helpful for you. Bearing in mind also that mentors are almost always serving teachers, and they have all the pressures and demands that serving teachers have, which is why when we look at schools, employers' arrangements for induction, one of the things we concentrate on is to make sure that mentors are supported. Because if mentors aren't supported, if they don't have the time and the space to do the job, then newly qualified teachers suffer, and mentors suffer as well, because they are taking on unsustainable burdens, which is in no one's interest. The other point I would say about mentors that I think is important, it's sad to say, but I'm afraid I think it is important, is that schools can still be, in many cases, quite hierarchical institutions, and they can have formal hierarchies and they can kind of have informal hierarchies as well. And your mentor, in order to be effective, really has to be someone who's got enough authority in the school, enough clout, that if something's wrong, they have the ability to put it right or get someone else to put it right. So your mentor has to have a degree of weight within the structure of the schools. If you're having a problem, if you're not getting the support you're entitled to, if there's an issue in terms of accessing your production and timetable teaching time, your mentor is someone who can do something about it. This is an interesting right. It's set out in the regulations and guidance. It has to be, I think, contextualized. And what you have the basic right not to have is to routinely teach classes or individual children with particularly challenging discipline problems. But I'm afraid in trying to interpret this right, there's no national standard you can apply. There's no national criteria that you can apply to a class or to an individual pupil to say that pupil's discipline problems cross the line and therefore I as an NQT shouldn't be teaching them. So it's generally, it's a relative measure. I've certainly taught in schools where the best behaved class in one school would probably have been the worst behaved class in another school. So the quality of behavior management, the quality of pupil discipline between different schools varies considerably. So the best way to look at this is it's a kind of internal measure. It's a measure of within the school or the setting within which you're working, that school or setting will know that there are particular classes and particular children who present discipline challenges that go beyond what might typically be expected in that school. And every school, I'll challenge any school to say this wasn't the case, every school will know which of its classes meet that criteria and which of its children present particularly challenging discipline problems in the context of that setting. Just to emphasize, it's really important as newly qualified teachers that you get an opportunity to demonstrate and develop your classroom behavior management skills. That's incredibly important, and you will get opportunities to do that during your induction year, no question about that. But I would say that your opportunities to work with classes or individual children who have particularly challenging discipline problems will arise later on in your careers, but it is important that in whatever setting you're working in, the most difficult classes, the most challenging individual children are not children that you teach routinely, because what you need to do is be able to focus on, in the best but realistic circumstances possible, on developing and demonstrating your behaviour management skills. You've got the right to teach the same class or classes on a regular basis. That's really important. One of the things you'll be doing is demonstrating that you can establish and maintain a good professional working relationship with groups of classes or a class of students that enables learning to take place. So it's establishing that relationship with pupils important, and to do that you need to have a degree of consistency in respect of the pupils that you're teaching, the students that you're teaching. In a primary setting, that's usually not a problem for most NQTs, because in this country anyway, the model that is used in the primary sector tends to be still that of an individual teacher is allocated a class, and that class belongs, if you like, in inverted commas, to that teacher. So you will teach them regularly. Sure, other teachers may come in every now and again to teach other subjects. You might have a specialist music teacher, or a specialist PE teacher, but generally you'll be working with that class on a regular basis. In the secondary sector, again, it tends, in most sensible schools, it tends not to be a problem. Secondary colleagues and colleagues in post-secondary, you will know that a huge amount of time is spent in those settings working out timetables. And you often have a member of a senior leadership team whose job is dominated in the summer term, certainly, by trying to work out timetabling. And even with the advent of computer models to help schools do that, it's a very involved process. So schools, sensible schools, are very loath to tinker with their timetables during the course of an academic year. So that tends to help secondary colleagues, because you're then allocated classes across all the year groups the school caters for, college caters for, and then you teach those classes on a regular basis. There are some schools, and it's quite rare, it does happen, there are some schools that seem to want to change and move around their timetable, or to move teachers allocated to classes on a fairly kind of regular basis. And that's generally not sensible for anyone, and sensible schools, as I say, avoid that at all costs. But if you find as an NQT that you're not really working with the same class or the same classes on a regular basis, that is a problem, because you're not then being given the best possible opportunity to show that you can operate effectively as qualified teachers in an employed context. So teaching the same class or classes on a regular basis doesn't often come up as a problem, but is a really important feature of a good induction experience. You've got the right to receive regular feedback about your progress. Now, there is, I suppose, the old adage that no news is good news. So if no one is giving you feedback, you might say, well, if they're not giving me feedback, I can assume that things are going well. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. That's generally not very good practice. You need to receive regular constructive and helpful, and maybe, yes, sometimes challenging feedback about your progress, but you need to know all the way through your induction where you stand. I would just say, again, I have no scientific evidence to back this up, it's just an experience, that in those rare cases where there are problems with induction, you'll almost always find that there was a failure on the part of the school to provide regular and accurate feedback. That always seems to be associated with problems that arise around induction. So good induction involves having regular feedback about your progress and achievement. That can come from your mentor, often may do, but it may not just be from your mentor. It could be, if you're in a secondary school, it could be from the head of department. If you're in a primary school, it could be from the head of your key stage, the head of a particular subject, so the head of maths or the head of English, the coordinators for those subjects. It doesn't have to be your mentor giving you feedback, but you do have the right to regular feedback about your progress, what you're doing well, what are your next stages in your development journey as qualified. So that's quite an important one as well. The 8th right here is a comprehensive program of support during your first year of teaching. And effectively what that means is that when you embark upon induction, you should have a pretty good idea about what your induction is going to look like, how it's going to pan out, if you like. And that can happen in lots of different ways. So there are some, for example, some local authorities, not as many as used to be the case, but some local authorities still run regular induction programs for newly qualified teachers working in their area. Some bigger, generally, multi-academy trusts, they run NQT programs for teachers working across the trust. Schools may have their own sources of support and advice, but that kind of professional development, that's an important part of your program of support. One of the things that NQTs always say, if you get an opportunity to do this, that they find really valuable, is having the opportunity to go and visit other schools. Because one of the, again, characteristic features, for whatever reason, of the education system is that individual schools can sometimes get very locked into their way of doing things. So this is how we manage behaviour. This is how we assess. This is how we plan. This is how we support children with special educational needs and disabilities. And it can be quite enlightening to go look at another school that is grappling with the same challenges, but goes about it in a different way. That can just, I think, broaden your horizons and give you useful points for reflection. But whatever that program of support involves, it's important that you're involved in that. Your school, your employer will have a pretty clear idea, should have, of what it thinks good induction looks like. And that's fine. You'll want to be guided by that, but it's important that induction isn't something that's done to you, it's something done with you. It's co-produced, to use that awful jargon word, but it's something where you contribute to that. So if you think that during the course of your induction there's a particular development need you've identified, you should be able to have that conversation with your mentor and make sure that that's factored into your program. So you should have a broad picture of what your program will look like, but you should also have an ability to influence and shape that as it develops. Really key is that, and this kind of goes back to the feedback point we were talking about earlier, that you receive early warning of any perceived problems or difficulties in your teaching practice. Schools should not be, so if you take that typical example, 1 year induction, let's say you're working full time, so you're expecting to complete induction at the end of the summer term, go through your induction year, no one says anything good or bad generally, maybe even good, about your progress and development. And then come May, June, maybe even July sometimes, you're told that there may be an issue about you successfully completing induction. Schools should not put NQTs in that position, really clearly set out in that guidance. So you need to make sure that schools, if they inform you, they should do that as early as possible. If you are informed that there might be problems or difficulties in your teaching practice, if the school rings alarm bells, even if they don't do that explicitly, but you pick up that maybe things aren't going as well as they should be, you need to contact us. Don't leave it, don't ignore it. As soon as you're concerned, even if you're not sure whether you should be concerned, really important to get in touch with us so we can help you and guide you through that and represent you if necessary. The final right I'll just touch on is the right to be treated as a professional. This is really important because you have qualified teacher status and all your colleagues have qualified teacher status, and that gives you an equality of status. Absolutely doesn't mean that you're working with more experienced colleagues and you'll want to draw on their experience and their expertise. Really helpful part of school life is the ability to draw upon support and the advice of colleagues. And as an NQT, they're almost always going to be more experienced than you. Fine, but that doesn't mean then that your status as a QTS holder should be diminished. If there are professional conversations happening in the school about an individual pupil, about a particular policy or procedure that the school is thinking of putting in place, and there are professional discussions taking place across the staff group, you should be welcomed into those conversations and your contribution should be respected. Big part of what we do is defending the professional status of all teachers, and the part you can play in that as individuals is simply insisting that you are treated as a professional across all of your induction and of course beyond. Let's briefly end by looking at the early career framework, which I promised I would touch on at the beginning, and that may impact on some of you. The early career framework is if you like, a new approach to induction for NQTs. And it's designed to address some of the shortcomings which there are in the current induction framework. And in our view, that early career framework has the potential to improve the induction experience. So in principle, we welcome a lot of what is in that early career framework. And it's due to be introduced fully across the country from the next academic. So not 2020-21, 2021-22. And one of the points around that early career framework is that all NQTs from next year, not you as an NQT cohort, but from next year, will have their statutory induction period extended from 1 to 2 years. That's quite a big change in the arrangements. However, what the DFE has decided to do is run, if you like, a pilot of the early career framework. And that pilot is going to be available to schools in Greater Manchester, the North East of England, Doncaster and Bradford. Schools in those areas can opt in to take part in the early career framework. Schools are under no obligation to do this, so it's all voluntary. So there may be schools, you might be working in Greater Manchester, North East of England, Doncaster or Bradford, and you may not have been told that you're in the ECF and you may not be in the early career framework. Your school has chosen not to take part in it. There was no compulsion on schools to take part. They could choose to take part if they wanted to. And in some parts of the country, there's an opportunity for schools to access some of the early career framework materials without formally taking part in the pilot. So some support and development materials which have the potential to be very good, to be blunt and honest, those materials will be made available to NQTs in other parts of the country. Another point to note is that even if your school is in one of the eligible areas to take part in the ECF, what some schools have done is they've said that some of their NQTs will take part in the ECF while others won't. So it's a very variable and mixed picture, but you may well have been told that you're taking part in the early career framework, or you may find out that you're taking part in the early career framework once you start your induction. Just a few things to point out with that, and hopefully they're reassuring in the main, is that the key thing to remember if you're taking part in the early career framework is that all the regulations and guidance and all the rights and entitlements you have as newly qualified teachers anyway, so colleagues who aren't in the ECF whose induction is based on the existing regulations and guidance, all of those continue to apply to people taking part in the ECF. So the basic position is that the ECF should be at least as good as all other induction experience. The plan is that hopefully it's better. So it certainly shouldn't be worse than what you would have had otherwise. It should at least be as good and hopefully better if all the support materials associated with it are in place. An interesting point, however, about pilot is that if you're taking part in the ECF pilot, then because new regulations and guidance aren't in place, the ECF pilot has to be based on the existing regulations and guidance. The existing 1 year statutory induction period will continue to apply. So even if you're taking part in the ECF, and even though the ECF is designed to have a 2 year statutory induction period, colleagues taking part in the early rollout will have a 1 year statutory induction period. That does raise good questions to which there aren't a lot of very good answers, but that is the position as it stands. So that does raise questions about the status of the second year in the pilot. If you're taking part in the pilot, your second year, while you will have completed your induction, should have a right to the additional benefits that come in the second year of the ECF, but you will have formally completed your induction. One of those entitlements is a continuing entitlement to a reduction in timetable teaching time. In the second year, that will be 5%, not 10%, but then compare that to a teacher, an NQT, completing their induction and moving into their second year of teaching, they have no entitlement to a reduction in timetable teaching time at all other than PPA time. So there's an enduring entitlement to a reduction in timetable teaching time that will apply to ECF early rollout participants. That's really significant. One of the key changes in respect of the ECF is around mentoring, because as I said earlier, for all NQTs, mentors are really important, but sometimes mentors don't have the time and space to do the job as well as they would like. And however good mentors are, every mentor can benefit from more time, more space, more resources, more training for them. That provision of additional support for mentors is a really important part of the ECF, and it's going to be an important part of the early rollout. But some of the requirements around mentoring and some of the support for mentors still aren't quite yet in place. So if you're taking part in the ECF early rollout, the benefits that should come from enhanced mentoring may not begin to be put in place until maybe the second autumn term of your induction. But even if that is the case, you're still entitled to, as all other NQTs are, a mentor who is required to provide you with a minimum standard of support, coaching, mentoring, and challenge as well. The final point that I'll raise, which has its upsides and downsides, if you like, and we'll have to wait and see how it pans out, is that when the surveys, our surveys and other surveys are conducted of newly qualified teachers and what they liked about their induction, didn't like so much about their induction, one of the messages that comes back quite consistently is that many NQTs would feel they would benefit from a more structured and formal program of support. So rather than sometimes those programs of support being developed and constructed on a bit of an ad hoc basis, is there a way that you can provide for all NQTs a consistent package of support covers key professional skills, knowledge, and understanding? That is a key part of the early career framework. So if we believe surveys of NQTs that have been conducted, that is a positive step because it's providing something that NQTs have said is really important to them. One issue potentially around that, however, is that currently quite a lot of the reduction in timetable teaching time, that induction time, is time that NQTs spend focusing on maybe doing a bit more planning, some marking, getting familiar with the school's materials, all the rest of it. It's quite a lot of discretion sometimes about how that is used. Under the ECF, there'll still be some of that available, but there may be less discretion about how that reduction in timetable teaching time is used because more time will have to be spent accessing support programs. As I say, the evidence suggests that most NQTs would welcome that, but we'll have to see how it works out in practice. But the bottom line is, if you're taking part in the ECF, induction experience should be at least as good as everyone else's and hopefully better than theirs. Those are all the points I wanted to make in the presentation. Just to end by saying, as I've said, if you've got an individual concern about your induction, your employment, really important to come and raise that with us. The best place you can do that is by contacting the member support advice team. Do look out for the NSWT's induction planner as well. That covers quite a lot of the advice and guidance that I've talked about, but in more depth. And if you feel you want to, by all means, go and look. I'd say go and look at the statutory guidance for, find that very easy. There's a link to it on our website, but you can find it very easy. Google it, it will come up on the gov.uk website. That statutory guidance is quite readable. It's just quite long and it's quite complex, but that does pretty much set out the A to Z of all your rights and entitlements and how your induction should be managed. And of course, the NSWT's website, which has a wealth of information, not just about induction, also about many of the issues that are important to all qualified teachers, all serving teachers, wherever they work, absolutely including newly qualified teachers. So hopefully that's been of use to you. We will give you copies of that presentation, so you've got that to hand. Just to kind of, let's see if there are any specific questions. Yeah, there's a couple of good specific questions that have been asked. So I'm just going to pick up the question that's asked by Lindsay. Morning, Lindsay. And Lindsay asks about how long you have to complete Induction, or if you're on the early career framework, how long do you have to complete Induction if you haven't yet been able to secure a post? There's no time limit. So there's no time limit on the amount of time between which you complete your QTS and then you begin your first inductable post. So don't worry too much about, in that respect, not having a post. There is a time limit. What you might find yourself doing is some short-term supply work, and that's fine. There's a limit on short-term supply work of 5 years, so you can only do short-term supply work. So the first day you do short-term supply work, the clock starts ticking and you've got 5 years. After that 5-year point, you can't do any more short-term supply work. You can only work in what's known as an inductable post. That could be a long-term supply placement, but a kind of daily supply, weekly supply, that probably isn't going to cut it. So you have some leeway in terms of doing short-term supply work. Don't worry too much about a clock ticking between when you have to start your first post and when you secure QTS. Really good question from James, and James says that he's worried about supply work because as a supply teacher, will the school invest in his CPD? That is a really good question, James, and one of the issues about doing supply work, maybe like all forms of teaching work, certainly has its advantages, but it has its disadvantages. And one of the disadvantages that many, not all, by no means all, some supply agencies are very good in this respect. But yes, it is that inability to access the CPD that other teachers are able to access. There's a couple of things I'd note around that, is that if you're doing supply work, we run fairly regular supply teacher seminars that provide CPD on some of the areas that supply teachers tell us they're not getting CPD on. So look out for those. The next one is in September. So you're absolutely free to sign up for that if you're doing supply teaching. That is found to be really helpful. However, if you're doing supply work that is eligible for induction, so in really broad terms, I'm afraid it's more complex than this in reality, but in broad terms, let's say you're doing a term of supply work, you get a term's placement in a school where you're doing supply work. Your school, if it's going to take you on to do that work as a supply teacher, must then ensure that you're able to access induction. So you have to work towards your induction if you're doing that kind of work. And then because you're doing work that counts towards induction, then the school has to provide you with that induction experience. And most schools will do that. I mean, you might think, well, lots of schools would be loath to do that properly. Most schools will do that, and then you'll get access to the support in that way. But you raise a really, really key point about the access of supply teachers to CPD. It is a problem. We do our very best to address that. Once the ECF has started, then that may be less of a problem, but I'm afraid probably, James, it's pretty likely you're going to start your career without accessing the early career framework. So look out for the advice and support that we provide. Got a very good question here from Paige. Good morning, Paige. And Paige asks, tells us that she's been told that she'll have access to a 1-year support program with the early career framework. What is that? Is that the same as the early rollout? It doesn't sound as though it is, Paige. What it sounds to me as though, you might remember we raised this in the presentation, it sounds to me as though, although your school is not taking part formally in the early rollout, perhaps because it isn't in one of the specified areas, what the government has said is it still wants to make the materials and resources from the ECF available to schools in other areas. So it sounds to me that that's what you have. So you'll be completing your induction on the basis of the existing regulations and guidance, but with some additional support from the ECF. In general, it'd be really interesting once you start on your induction page to maybe find out more about how that's going. But in principle, that's probably a good thing, because some of the resources that are being produced around the ECF are good, and they do provide exactly the kind of support and advice and guidance that lots of NQTs in previous years have said they wished they'd had during their induction. So hopefully that will lead to an enhanced induction experience. But we'll monitor that carefully, and feedback from any NQT taking part in the ECF, whether formally or in a school that's accessing some of the resources, that would be really welcome. We've got time for one more question. which is a good question. I'm working in an SEN school. This is from Shona. Hello, Shona. And Shona says, I'm working in an SEN school in a year 7-8 class. My training is primary 5 to 11. Is this okay? Each case, I think, Shona, turns on its own facts. And I think in an SEN setting, in a special alternative setting, it kind of depends upon the nature of the curriculum. That's the key point. The nature of the curriculum being offered to students. But if the students in the school are accessing a curriculum and accessing subject content that you might generally expect to see taught to children in Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2, if it's adapted in some way and you feel confident with that curriculum content, so you don't feel you're being asked to teach, let's say, for example, mathematics, a level of mathematics that wasn't necessarily taught during your training, that should be okay. But I think in those circumstances, look at the curriculum that's being offered. Your first question is to think about your degree of comfort with that curriculum. Do you think that's something you can manage and that you can deal with? For most year 7 and 8 classes, training goes up to primary, goes up to year 6. So for 11-year-olds, you should be reasonably comfortable with anything that those kind of early phases of the Key Stage 3 curriculum can throw at you. But as ever, if you feel that there are, as your induction progresses, if you feel that there are elements of the curriculum where you don't think you're comfortable with, or where you think you might need more support, then you need to be able to ask your mentor or whoever it is in your setting for that support, just to make sure that you are doing what you're there to do, which is to provide the best quality learning experience to those children in that setting. I think that's all we have time for this morning. So thank you very much for joining us. There's a lot of questions there. We will take those away, absolutely. Make sure that we look at those. Don't forget also, colleagues, as I say, if there's an individual question about you and about your personal circumstances, then it's really important you get in touch with us and raise that. So thank you ever so much for your time this morning, and I hope that's been of use to you. Send out the presentation. You know where we are. You know where we are online. You know where we are on social media. Reach out to us. Make sure you share your experience and seek some support and guidance if necessary. Take care. All the best for your induction, and I look forward to seeing you possibly virtually, possibly even in real life. Who knows how this might turn out very, very soon. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.